Hi everybody, today I would like to introduce you to my one foolproof recipe of editing my wildlife photographs. This video will provide you with a great guideline of how to approach a post-production process so that you can get the best out of your images taken in the field while taking your photography to a whole new level. This recipe works great for any conventional exposed photographs, but if you stick around to the end, I will provide you with some easy tips and tricks how to edit creative captures as well. Before we get started, my name is Janine and I'm a professional wildlife photographer with Pangolin Photo Safaris. Probably the best job in this world because I take people like you into the wild and help you get the best photographs out there. If you would like to join our growing community of wildlife enthusiasts, please don't forget to subscribe right here and you will never miss out on any of our trips, videos or tutorials that we post on this channel. So let's not waste any of your time and get started. My following recipe can be applied to any of the Adobe Lightroom products, but is also applicable for Photoshop, or shall we say Camera Raw. However, if you use any of the other post-production softwares, such as Capture One, Affinity, or Lumina, for instance, you'll be able to apply most steps identical, so stick around. To break it down for you, my recipe exists of exactly 5 steps and can easily be done in under 5 minutes. Step number 1 is cropping. I don't want to dive too deep into that subject as it can be very subjective. And if you would like to learn more, please check out my video on cropping. However, here you can see that you have the option to both crop into your image by taking the corner very tightly, as well as rotate it in case your horizon wasn't straight, just like mine. Alternatively, you can make use of the ruler to help you straighten it out. The one thing I would like to appeal to you is to choose your aspect ratio consciously. What I mean with that is try and keep a locked aspect ratio, as your goal should be to try and display the image over the full medium that you have chosen. Therefore, you need to figure out where you want to show the image, then what the matching aspect ratio is, and lastly, whether this fits the particular picture, as not every image shows its full potential when squeezed into a certain frame, such as here. It just won't work nicely. Once you have cropped your image to your liking, it is now time to perfect your exposure. Even if your exposure is pretty much spot on, you will want to go into your basic tab to work on your tone. That is especially true for RAW files, as they come, by definition, flat and simply put, boring. Your goal should now be to create the largest amount of contrast in your image without clipping your white point on the right side of your histogram or crunching your blacks on the left side of your histogram. This will make your image pop more and seemingly more three-dimensional. So let's start with our whites and blacks by grabbing the slider and holding the Alt or Option key at the same time. You can now push the slider until you do not see any more white in the frame, but concentrate on the animal here. Where it turns white, it burns. And the same with the black slider, where we do not want to see any blacks in the frame. By definition, this should now create a perfect exposure within your animal. Alternatively, you can click the little triangles in your histogram to display the red and blues, which indicate the same, but I get distracted by the colors in my image. Now we can fine adjust our settings with the shadows and the highlights. We could use the same approach with these sliders here, but I tend to use my tummy feeling. In a regular exposed photograph, my shadows tend to go to the plus side until I'm satisfied with how much details I can see on the skin of my animal, and the highlights to the minus side. Be careful that the highlights do not make your whites look gray in the process. If you're not sure about your choices, move your sliders all the way from the left to the right so that you get a feeling for the interval you're working within. A fast processing computer truly helps in that practice. Photographs that have been shot in the golden hour of the day tend to look unpleasantly yellow if you follow this approach. However, that is something we can fix with our temperature slider or in a separate process in your HSL and color tab. Your exposure is still correct. If your photograph turned too yellow, you can now start with step number 3. If not, you can save some time and skip straight to step number 4. To fix your warm image, we can always change the temperature if it was shot in RAW. If shot in JPEG though, this is probably the most difficult to fix, as you simply do not have enough raw data left to alter your image in color tones, hues, and luminance. That being said, even in RAW, I'm not a big fan of our white balance tools as I find them too crude. They simply cool down your image, but after all, we wanted a golden tone, which is why we often chase the golden hour in wildlife photography. A simple fix is to open the HSL and color tab, in which I will do 2 things. Number 1, I will often change the hue of our yellows and oranges to a more reddish tone rather than a greener tone, as the yellow in the image reminds me more of pea, than a warm, earthy color. In a second step, I will slightly tone down the saturation of these 2 specific colors. That way, I keep a golden tone throughout my image without the unnatural yellow tint of the photograph. In step number 4, we open the Detail tab in order to sharpen your image. This step is more technical than creative, and I often tend to forget it, but it is a crucial step, especially when you intend to print. Remember, raw images are soft by definition, which is why Lightroom and Photoshop already sharpen each raw file by 40 points to start off with. However, sharpening a pixel is not always doing it any good. Over-sharpening can look pixelated. I like to call it crunchy. Especially when shooting on higher ISOs, this pixelated look likes to appear. Therefore, it is best not to sharpen everything in your image. This pixel, for instance, doesn't require sharpening at all. It is completely irrelevant. Matter of fact, for the background, we often have the opinion, the blurrier, the better. Therefore, we will define which areas in the image we want to sharpen with a masking slider. Please do not confuse it with our local area masks. Sadly, Adobe used the same name, which can be rather confusing, but these are 2 entirely different tools. By taking the masking slider and holding the Alt or Option key, we can define where we want to sharpen. Everything that remains white is sharpened. So on the default of 0, everything is sharpened, and on 100, nothing gets affected. I usually mask my sharpening amount between 80 and 100 points. I want to pull the slider until I see the most minimalistic but relevant details of my image. After that, I can increase my amount quite significantly. By magnifying the image 300%, you make sure that you can see the effect and simply pull the slider as far as is acceptable to you before the image becomes too crunchy. Have a look at the effect without you applying the mask first. See how much more pixelated the image gets? By taking this step, you can even reduce apparent noise in high ISO images and certainly make sure the relevant areas get the sharpening they require. In our last step of our recipe, we are now using the local area masks, and I typically tend to create 4 different masks. Hereby, you need to be careful that you are not breaking any rules in case you're intending to submit the picture to a competition. Number 1, I want to elevate my subject. So I choose to mask only my subject in order to increase texture and clarity. Be careful not to overdo it, especially in a color image, and never apply this technique to humans, as you might lose a friend or 2. Humans actually prefer the opposite. Both of these sliders are combination tools that can affect your whites and your blacks in the image as well. Sometimes I like the extra pop, but I don't like the extra darkening that they apply, so I tend to soften it a bit again by pulling the shadows a little bit further to the plus side. This also highlights our animals a bit more. Next, I want to create the opposite effect in the backdrop. Instead of making it pop further, I want to tone it down, which is also the reason I didn't touch any clarity in our basic tab, which would make it way too crunchy. For this exercise, I could simply copy and invert mask number 1. However, if the intent is to blur the backdrop, then we shouldn't be affecting anything that stands in the same plane as our animal, as it will look physically incorrect. So this approach only works if your picture only has 2 planes, such as a bird on a stick, for instance. Otherwise, I suggest the use of a radial gradient. By pulling the radial gradient over the plane that the animal stands in and inverting it, you ensure that we create somewhat of a natural progression of depth of field, where we can soften the backdrop more towards the front and the back of the image, while bleeding it in towards your subject. To avoid soft washing your subject, we need to subtract it from our mask. Now we can soften the backdrop to our liking and even reduce the noise within the image further, while almost creating the look of a wider apertured lens. This works better if your animal was standing far away from your backdrop. If you are lacking subject separation, the same approach will look physically incorrect or fake. And this is something I truly like about the editing process, as it teaches you what mistakes to avoid in the field and what to look out for in a great wildlife photograph when choosing to take or edit the image. If you would like to give the image a more dramatic effect, you can now test if changing the exposure within your radial gradient further elevates your subject. I like to go brighter to create a happy and fun mood, and darker to create a dramatic mood. The last 2 masks are quick and not compulsory, but I always like to check my images for distracting hotspots or super dark shadows. Hotspots are bright spots that could appear both behind but also on our subject, that takes our attention away from looking at its face. Both masks, I simply brush the relevant area and either take my exposure slightly down or up while adding a bit of warm temperature. All this does is to make sure that our attention is not drawn away unnecessarily. See the difference between the hotspots turned on and off, or the shadows in this case, as well as the hotspots on the dog's backside. And with that, you will have masterfully completed your image. While we initially didn't think that our image required much, you will see that the difference is staggering. Subtlety wins the race here. Nobody's supposed to identify that it has been edited. In a creative capture, you will have to change your approach in step number 2. Creative captures are often defined by unusual exposures, such as high-key or low-key pictures. Areas intentionally get burned and dark shadows are often welcomed. As a rule of thumb, you can usually pull your whites and blacks much further apart from each other in a black and white picture. Even clarity can be added much stronger, so much so that it looks unnatural. Don't worry, you can soften it again with your highlights and shadows. Dark images, in turn, require you to keep your blacks and shadows dark, rather than pulling them to the plus side. Therefore, forget all about the approach of pressing your Alt key and rather trust your eyes. If you want to learn more about editing creative captures, please check out Sabina's video right here. I hope this will give you some guidance in the future and an alternative to pressing the auto button when not sure how to approach an edit. Have fun with your images, and I hope to welcome you someday with us on a safari. Bye bye.